Hi guys, this is Mike. In this Cinema 4D tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use the selection tools. What we're going to go over is live selection, loop selection, ring selection, found break selection, invert, grow selection, shrink selection, select connected, hide selected, hide unselected, unhide all, set selection, and convert to selection. So let's do some selecting within Cinema 4D. Now I have my original cube that I have set up, and I want to do some selecting of the edges, points, and polygons. Now you notice when I'm in the live selection tool and I move my mouse over any of the polygons while I'm in polygon mode, you'll see a little white box appear on the polygon. It will highlight in white. That lets you know what polygon you're about to select. Left click will then give you the selection. And it's the same thing in edges. And it's the same thing in points, point mode. So you can make these selections on any of your edges and points and polygons, depending on what mode you're in. Now, to toggle between your points, edges, and polygons, you can also hit the return key on your keyboard. So I'll allow you to quickly toggle between each of these modes. And what you can also do when you are in polygon mode and you are in your move tool, if you double click on any polygon, it will make a selection of every polygon on your object, on the object that you double clicked on. So move tool, double click, and now we'll select everything. If you're on edge mode and you double click, that's going to make a selection for this loop, the loop that goes around your entire object. So let me try that again. So you're on this particular edge, you're highlighting it by mousing over, double click on that, and that's going to select the loop that goes continuously around your object. Now in point mode, and you have your move tool, and you double click on a point, what that's going to do is going to open up a little box, and it's going to give you some information about the point and where it is in 3D space. So it'll give you X, Y, and Z. I'm going to cancel out of this. So it just gives you some options right away just by using your move tool, by double clicking. Now what you can also do when you're in polygon mode and you make a selection with your live tool, you can go into your edge mode by holding down command and left mouse button, click on your edge mode, and that's going to make a selection around the edge of your polygon that you had selected. So select the polygon, command click on the edge mode button, and that will make a selection around that polygon. Now let's take a look briefly at some of our other selection tools. We have rectangle selection, and if I click and drag with the rectangle selection and I have tolerance selection unchecked, and I'll click and drag and it makes this rectangle, anything within this rectangle, and I'm still holding down the mouse button, the left mouse button without releasing, anything within this rectangle will be selected. Now if I let go of the mouse, you can see it selects all these edges, but doesn't select anything that's outside of that edge, outside of that rectangle. So even though I have this rectangle and it's over these top polygons, those won't be selected. Same for this edge here. So for an example, if I only want to select this edge, this loop of edges, then I pull out this rectangle, make sure that all of these edges are within this box, and I release the left mouse button, only that will be selected. Now, if I have tolerance selection checked, and I left mouse button and click and drag, any edge that is crossed over into this rectangle will be selected. So you can see that anywhere this rectangle will make that selection. And that also works for your points as well, and polygons. Now, as I've been doing all of this, I've had only select visible elements unchecked. If I have select visible elements checked, anything that I select within our rectangle selection, and I rotate around, you can see that only the visible elements that you see with your camera in your viewport here will be selected. Now if I uncheck only select visible elements, and I make this selection, you can see I also select polygons in the rear of this object as well. So just keep in mind as you combine these options for the type of selecting that you want to do. And we have a few other different types of options that we can choose from. This lasso, and I have tolerance selection and only visible elements unchecked. Let me turn back on only select visible elements. So you can make more detailed selections by using some of these tools, especially when you get into some of the more complex models that we may have. And you have polygonal selection, which is basically click, release your mouse button, click again, release your mouse button, and click again, release, and then click again. And then just make sure you connect that point in order to make a selection. Just keep in mind which options you have selected, such as tolerance selection. Okay, so let's move on to loop selection. Now, loop selection is going to select a loop of polygons, edges, or points. So if I move this tool, and you can also go to your keyboard and press UL for the loop selection. And you can see this highlight as I mouse over my object. Left mouse button click, and you can see it makes a loop around the entire object. And that works in edge mode. And point mode. Now you have a few different options here. You have stop at boundary edges, and you have select boundary loop. And some of these will be more prevalent depending on the type of object that you might be using. So for an example, if I go to polygon mode and make this selection and I delete, and I go into edge mode, loop selection, you'll notice that as I'm mousing over my edge, I don't see that highlight. And now I do. So select boundary loop will only select the boundary of your object. Stop at boundary edge, you can see terminates at an edge of your object. And you can see this also affects in your various other modes. Now we have ring selection. Now this will work in your edge mode. So if you go to edge mode, ring selection, it will select a ring of edges. You can see the highlight. And you can see that in a horizontal or vertical. And also in point mode as well. Let's move to Fong break selection. So if we click on this, you can see that we have this blue outline on our object. And this is controlled by our Fong tag. So we want to make sure we have use edge breaks checked in our Fong tag. And then when we have that, our tool selected, we select all, and that's only going to select our outline of our Fong break. And this is useful for when you want to select your edges of your object, but not a lot of these interior edges. And that way we can use a bevel, say MS on your keyboard, and then we can bevel out our edges a little bit. Now we have invert, which inverts our selection. So if we have our selection of our edges, and then we do invert, we select all the edges that were not selected. And we have those selected now. We have grow selection. So if I go to, say, UL for our loop selection, and then I press grow selection, it'll grow the selection from our original selection. And we can continue growing our selection throughout our object. Now shrink selection, as you might imagine, will shrink the selection that we had until we get to our point that we have down here. And we have select connected, so whatever is selected and connected to this edge will then select make those selections. Now we have hide selected, so anything that's selected will hide. And let me unhide all. And this is useful for when you have some pretty complex geometry and they're kind of overlapping and you can't get into, or you can't view the polygons, edges, and points that you want to manipulate. So you'll hide selected, and that way you can start working on, say, another part of your model that wasn't visible before. They're not deleted, you're just hiding that selection. And so we can bring that back by unhide all. Now we could also do the reverse. We have this selected, and then we can go hide unselected. So that's going to hide everything that's not selected. So these are just a few ways of moving around our object and getting the geometry out of our way so that we can work on a specific point of our geometry. So I'm going to go to unhide all. Now we also have set selection. This is a very useful function, and what we can do is, if you ever have a certain point or certain part of your object that you want to come back to over and over for various things. Say for an example, you have an object or a character and you want to select his eyes and you want to change his color of his eyes, or you want to change the shape of his eyes, but you want to go through and imagine that you have a more complex object and more complex geometry in order to select those specific objects, or those specific polygons. You can always go to it by making a selection tag. So I'm going to make this a little bit easier to understand by going to another object, and I'm going to go to a sphere. I'm going to pull this out, and I'm going to rotate this parametric sphere, and I'm going to hold down Shift, and that's going to move our object in 10-degree increments. So I'm going to get to 90 degrees, release my mouse, and then I'm going to go to Make Editable. I'm going to go to our Live Selection tool, and I'm going to select all of these polygons. Now you can also do that with our loop selection. So I can go to UL, or select our little button here, and move my mouse over to this area and just press our mouse button to make that selection. So now what I can do is I can go to Set Selection, and now you'll notice that we now have a tag that is dropped in right next to our object, right next to our sphere. And when I select that tag, we now have a name that we can now change, and we can name whatever we want. So I can name it just Center. And this can be named whatever you like. Now, whenever I click off and I start doing other things to our object, if I want to get back to this, I can simply just double click on our tag and it makes that selection. Now, this is a very obvious and easy way of viewing this, but you can imagine when you have a complex selection that you need to get to, instead of making this over and over again, you can simply just make your selection. Now I want to make make something a point here so you don't get confused. And this could cause a problem, especially when first starting out using set selection. You want to make sure that, say you have your set selection here, which is your center, And so you click off, and now you have this deselected. And say I want to make this selection, UL, and I make that selection, and I want to make another set selection by going down here. But before you press set selection, you want to make sure that your tag is deselected. See, right now I still have my original set selection tag. If I press set selection, it's going to overwrite this tag. So now this tag will now be this selection. So what you need to do before you make another set selection tag, you want to make sure that you click off of this object, click back on it again, and now make your set selection. Now you'll have two tags. So it's just something to be careful of when you first start doing this and making set selection tags. You want to make sure that this original tag is deselected by just clicking off it and then clicking back onto your object. And now, anytime you double click, you now have those selections. And then you can name these whenever you like. Now we also have convert selection, which is a very nice little tool. Say for an example, you go to your polygon selection and you make this selection. We'll select the center and we press convert selection. You're going to get a little box that comes up. And then what you do is you click on current, which is our current selection. And we'll go to something, say edges. So press edges and make sure this radio button is selected. And at this point, we can convert. It will go to your edges in edge mode, and you'll see that all these polygons all these edges that were connected to our polygon selection has now been selected. And of course, we can do that for any of our other options. So we have current, edges, and then we can go to points, convert. Now all the points or vertices that were connected to our edges have now been selected. We're now in point mode. I put a link in the description to download project files. You can also go to astronomic3d.com to download project files from this tutorial and all the tutorials that I've made so far. Thanks for watching.